If I'm going to weep, if I'm going to hurt, I'll be honest about it, and I'll tell people, hey, I'm hurting right now, and there's nothing that can be said or done that will make me better, but I need you to know. I've heard of miscarriage being described as a disenfranchised grief or ambiguous loss. I felt a deep rage about the whole thing, not at anyone in particular, but almost just this injustice at, we had all these plans and hopes and dreams, and they did not come to fruition.
Hey, Good Grief fam, welcome back to another episode. Today, I'm excited to be joined by author, chaplain, dad, husband, and just all-round legend, Joon Park, who wrote the book, As Long As You Need Permission to Grieve. Now, if you've been following us on socials for any length of time, I've recently been posting a lot about this, and we've spoken about it in some recent episodes, and I just had to reach out to Joon because honestly, this book is just one of the most raw, honest conversations and experiences with grief in so many different spheres and facets and places and times that it's a must read. And it makes me feel closer to my own grief. And so today we're going to be breaking this book down. Joon, excited to have you here. Welcome, brother. How are you? All the way out in Florida.
Ryan, thank you so much for having me, inviting me to your table, to your space. I really appreciate that you gave a shout out in the book. That's kind of how I unofficially met you. You did a video championing the book, and I was very happy and grateful, honored, humbled, all the things to see that. So I appreciate you and your time. Thank you for finishing the book as well. That's a big deal. Thank you.
Man, did credit where credit's due. And I just told you before, I finished it literally as of this morning. I've got a few books on the go, just, and that's generally not my style, but at the moment I'm trying to sink my teeth into as much as I can, but yours has just been amazing. And you won't be able to see it maybe at home, but Joon, I don't know if you can see the front cover is where I use a technique I learned from someone on Instagram where I take these little chapter notes or little highlights in the front cover so that when I or someone else that I pass the book on to opens it, they can very quickly see where some of those aha moments are. And the front cover is full. So, man, it's been a lot to chew through. It's weird to say congratulations on a book, when we're talking about death, grief, and loss. But how has it been received since launching?
I get messages and kind words, comments about the book. Posts have been shared about it, people sharing their thoughts about it. And what I've seen at least two things. One is I am overwhelmed and very thankful for the honesty of people sharing their stories, because the book itself is my journey as a chaplain and also a lot of my own grief, a lot of being at bedside in the hospital across hundreds, if not thousands of deathbeds. And then also it's sort of memoir-ish. And then it's a guide through grief. And so people are sharing about the book, and also they'll tag on or they'll include their own story and how grief has affected them. And I recognize that it's personal for everyone. And I think the other thing I'm seeing is there is interest in a book like this. You kind of said, congratulations to a book on grief. It's hard to say, but at the same time, I do see such an interest in this piece. People are ready to have this conversation. They've been ready.
Big time.
Yeah. And so I'm seeing a lot of, if I can even dare say, just like when you said congratulations, can I say excitement or enthusiasm? Like an energy?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I mean, the space, as a whole online, it's strange that, I guess, I mean, maybe the pandemic really sped up that collective understanding of grief, but online it's hard not to find people talking about grief in the last, 12, 18, 24 months. Have you seen that as well? I mean, you've been journeying this for years now as a chaplain, but to see it really take off online?
Yeah, I think there's, in my mind and heart at least, I see four big topics taking off. I consider these the big four. There's mental health, which I think the last 2 decades there's been more open and honest and gentle conversation about it. And then there's trauma, and in specific, intergenerational trauma. We're seeing that in films and TV shows. I think Pixar has taken it on. I think that's why the show This Is Us has really taken off. shows similar to that, movies exploring how trauma is passed down through generations, and then in relation to that, family dynamics and family trauma and how family stories are passed on, and then grief. I mean, in the last 10 years at least, I feel like there are more even kids movies, cartoons. There are children's books being written about loss, because there is something about culturally, socially, and I think even religiously and spiritually, where there's a fear around talking about loss, and understandably so. There's an anxiety about talking about mortality, because anyone who approaches that abyss, the abyss of the irretrievable, it's an incredibly fearful and scary thing to talk about it, especially when it touches our own stories. And yet the way through it is to be honest about it, to confront it, to face the reality of mortality. And I think that's why we're seeing interest and also a courage to talk about it.
And why do you think, I mean, I think that's fascinating. Why do you think in the West, the US, Australia, the UK, the larger Western countries, why is it that we're so unfamiliar and fearful of it? Where, like, my roots come from Sri Lanka, the East, much closer to death. But even New Zealand in the Maori cultures, they'll actually lie with the body for days after and mourn collectively as a family and as a community for the body. But it seems like in our Western larger cultures, we're so unfamiliar with it. Why is that? And why are we only just starting now to try and catch up?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Ryan. And thanks for bringing up the cultural element of that too. I guess to try to make a long story shorter, really it's, there's a huge divide between the way that I've seen Western culture and the global majority approach death. And what Caitlin Doty in her book, From Here to Eternity, it's an excellent book. I recommend it to everybody. She, I believe, was a funeral home director for a time and then traveled the world. And she began to do a study on what she calls death engagement. And she recognized that every culture in the world has a very close, intimate, and upfront death engagement, except for many Euro, Anglo, Westernized cultures. And part of the theory behind that, and I'm in the middle of kind of collecting data, doing a study on it, but I've talked about it, I sort of mentioned it in the book a little bit, is that my guess is Westernized culture, in its sort of historical chase for annexation and conquering, two things had to happen. The oppressor had to stamp out the grief of the people that they were subjugating. No monuments, no memorials, unmarked graves. Let's stamp out their language, their culture, their history. You cannot grieve your dead. Because grief is very often the root and the basis of a people rising up, saying that this is not okay and we want to reclaim what was taken from us. And also the oppressor had to also stamp out their own grief in order to keep conquering. So oppression hurts the oppressor and the oppressed. And you sort of roll that into today, where we have a culture of hustle and grind and accomplishment, the institutional ways in which we are made to be productive, to constantly both produce and consume. And really, you've seen the ways of conquering and oppression get rolled up into our world machine, into the wheels and the gears that grind us up and basically squeeze every ounce of product out of us, of productivity and contribution. And so when you have something like that, a system that continues to grind us up, there's barely any room for grief between the gears. Grief is considered something that is going to cause us to pause in order to mourn the losses that we have, to honor the ways in which we've lost, and also to fuel any sort of rising up, pushing back and saying, this is injuring us. We can't have this anymore. And so in Western cultures, we see that a lot. And I think you see that manifest itself and play out in the way that even when you think about the concept of the funeral home, we bury our bodies 6 feet under. We stuff them with formaldehyde to preserve them. Even the box in which we put the body in, $10,000. The funeral itself, it's so costly and exorbitant. and then we jettison all the belongings through a garage sale, or we take it to a landfill. And you're right in that every other culture has a much more intimate death engagement. Even if I were to name several things like Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, or there's the one culture, and I know I'm going to get it wrong, a particular people or tribe in which they exhume their dead ancestors every summer and have tea with them at the table. Even in my own culture in Korea, we have Chesa, which is Death Day. We don't celebrate just birthdays. We also birthdays. We also celebrate death days as well. And every year,
that one right there is quite hard. I've noticed inside of our community where there is a large, population where it's like, I don't want to talk about the death day. When there's only 2 times in our life when our heart starts and it stops, and that's when we're born and when we die.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a few people inside the brackets that have some other moments in between there. You've seen some of them, but I think coming to terms with and spending time around that grief, so important. What I've noticed in your book, and this really struck me early in the book, and it ties with this idea of our Western culture not being close to grief, is that we get it wrong so many times, and I think that stops a lot of people from saying something or saying anything, because what if I say the wrong thing? But man, I'm the first to put my hand up and say, I've said the wrong things. I've offered the wrong gestures. I've not been there when I should have been. I've been there when I shouldn't have been. You're super honest and raw throughout the whole book of the mistakes, the words that you've said that you wish you could have taken back. Why are you so open and vulnerable about that?
Yeah, I think I have a lot of empathy for those who are trying to say the right thing or feel like they need to fill the silence, because there's no perfect thing to say. And when we try to console or comfort someone in grief, it's messy. And so I really try to be fair in the book, and just fair when I'm at the bedside. When someone says something clunky or imposing, when someone says something overbearing, I used to get really, really angry about it because I wanted to shout and scream like, don't you know that that's not helping? And things like, this is God's will to refine you in the fire, or God's punishing you, or everything happens for a reason, which, by the way, is a title of Kate Bowler's book, and in parentheses, everything happens for a reason and other lies I've loved.
Wow.
Yeah. And even pop culture things that are not religious in nature, like just be strong, don't cry, you'll get over it, keep the past in the past, sure. Don't ask for a lighter load, get a stronger spine, those kinds of things.
Wow.
Yeah, whether it's religious culture or pop culture, we say these kind of toxic and positive, overly positive things. And I think when I got mad at it, I saw it as somebody being malicious, but what I've realized now over the years is that so many of us are so fearful of loss. And also, we want to help the person who's hurting. And so, being fearful, we want to fill the silence of loss because we're so uncomfortable when we're confronted with
awkward.
Loss.
It's messy.
Yeah. It's messy. There's discomfort. We're also faced with the brevity of how quick it can go, and how unfair it seems, how sudden and severe. I've seen that those who die don't plan on dying in a hospital, don't plan on the way that they have died. I think it's 1 out of 3 people do not die at home. And so,
interesting.
Yeah, and then there's also just the wanting to help. We are, by default, automatically as humans, naturally compassionate. And we want to say something that's going to help, but sometimes we have a theological scaffolding, sort of an idea of what we think we're supposed to say or how things are supposed to be, and we offer sort of the Swiss cheese theology that we have, that we inherited. And I can't really fault the person who inherited that, because they learned it from someone who didn't know any better either. And so what I'm really seeing is a whole lot of people really not having the capacity or skill set or the tools, and I include myself in that it took me a long time to learn that. And so when I see people saying things that are not helpful, on one hand, I do want to pause and correct them and educate them if necessary. But I also try to do it with compassion. I might say something like, I know that you're trying to help. And I know that what you're saying is something you feel like you need to say because you really care about me. And at the same time, what you're saying isn't helpful. Really what I need is just you. I don't need a lecture or a lesson. I don't need,
so good.
I don't need an epiphany. And so I hold those boundaries, but I hold them with gentleness because I realize we're all trying to help. We're all uncomfortable. And certainly there are some people who are not trying to be helpful at all. They really are just trying to push something or impose something or proselytize. And at the same time, the majority of people, they don't know what to say and they grasp for something. So how can I hold them with gentleness too?
I think it's also really, it's difficult as humans. We fill air with words when simply silence or being would just do it justice. It would just do the job. Like on a podcast here, it's our job to talk, but there are moments where we can just sit and take in what's been said. But in a conversation with someone, I often will mention this to friends. It's like, see how long the conversation, even if it's not about grief, over a coffee, how long will a conversation be silent? It's very rare because we're just so awkward with it. And I think compiled or compounded with grief, it's just an explosion where these words come out. I think you answered that, perfectly. What about from like you're in the hot seat of they're expecting something? I mean, a lot of your stories in here, the patient, more often than not, and maybe these are the ones that you've just chosen, are expecting, hey chap, as they call you, like, say something. Can you pray? Can you share something? How do you feel in those moments? How do you come to words when you feel like there are no words or there should be silence? What do you do there?
Yeah, Ryan, that's a really good question. There are times when my patient or a family member or friend, they do want something to hold on to. And there comes a time when listening and stillness and silence, where there may be a time, maybe it's 1 out of 100 encounters or out of 100 minutes of me listening, there's just 30 seconds where they need something. And so patients that I pray with, I may offer something within the prayer. Or patients who really ask me for my wisdom, what I often try to do, whether that's in the prayer or that's in the wisdom or in the thing that they need, is I will often try to go back through the things that they said, which is where it helps to have my sort of listening ears on. And I try to solidify the things that they told me that were giving them strength or helpful to them, or even go back through their story and try to make some kind of sense or meaning out of the things that they told me. And I assume that those, very often, those who have questions also have their own answers. It's different than what a minister or a pastor does, Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So those who have questions often have their own answers.
Yeah, and they may not always know it, but, ministers and pastors, they often preach, so they impart theology and information. And their hope is that here are the things that I want to give you in order to make sense out of your life, who God is, who you are, and then what you can do about those things. But a chaplain is different. A chaplain doesn't come in as a preacher. A chaplain comes in as a presence. And I will listen and I will come alongside, and I don't try to impart information. In fact, I will often enter the worldview of the patient and what is important to them. And those things which are important to them, their values, their system, those are the tools with which they can continue on through the suffering that they're experiencing. And so certainly my patients, sometimes they don't always have all the tools. They don't always have the capacity or the skill set. So I may give them a little bit of something, but I'm holding a candle to the floor so that they can see further ahead of them. I'm not trying to tell them to do anything or to impose anything at all. And there's a very delicate dance with that, because in some sense, I'm trying to give them self-sufficiency. And in another sense, I'm under their shoulder as they're leaning on me, as they're trying to make it through this valley, this wilderness, this desert. And so, I can give you one example, and I think I mentioned this in the book. When I walked into this room, this patient was reading a book. And I happened to have read that book too. And, she told me that her favorite part of the book was when the author went on this retreat and just got to rest. And there's a whole section in the book about this retreat that this author went on. And as we were talking at the very end, I went back to that kind of thing she told me in the beginning, because what I always assume is that everything that everyone tells me, they tell me for a reason, even if they don't know it. And so she was talking about how maybe she needed this hospital encounter to get some rest that she didn't know she needed. And what I told her at the very end was, I'm sorry that this hospital admission, it's not exactly the retreat that you wanted, hearkening back to the book. And for some reason, that just hit something deep in her. And that doesn't sound like the deepest thing to say, but she just began to full on weep. And I wonder if her soul, her mind, her body, her heart was just reaching out for something. It connected to something so deeply in that book. And then I named it for her. She needed rest, but not like this. She needed a retreat. She needed to pull away from her life and from her world. And this wasn't ideal. And at the same time, here she was getting some rest. A lot of complicated layers. Yeah. And so things like that, where I'm walking with a patient as they're trying to make sense and meaning out of the crisis, this very new thing that is happening to them, the worst day of their lives even. And it takes... I can't say that it's easy, Ryan. It's really tough.
I can't imagine it being easy, dude. Yeah. I've sat bedside with a number of people that have passed, friends, family, and so forth, and numerous different forms of death, but hundreds, if not thousands, that you've journeyed with. Reading this book, I'm weeping. I'm weeping. There's a number of stories there from the very beginning. There's a mother that loses a child. Mm. There's Maisie that you talk about. I connected really closely with Maisie, and then your friend John as well. There are a few people in the book that just really struck a chord in me, and reflecting on your, it's your profession, it's your job, it's your career, it's your passion. Man, it's a hard road to walk. And coming to the end of the book, when you start reflecting on all of those people walking down that hallway, I won't spoil the book for everybody. It just really brings it to the essence and the core of what it is that you do and how many people you've journeyed with. So I don't like saying I can't imagine. I can imagine how hard that road has been, but from myself and everybody else, thank you. And you're one of a team of chaplains. Thank you for doing the job that you are. And you're one of a team of chaplains in one hospital out of all of the hospitals. And it's a great mission that you're on. Can we talk about faith and wisdom for a second? You mentioned faith and wisdom. Sometimes it's to share faith. Sometimes it's to impart wisdom. From your experience being bedside, what have you noticed between, I guess, the way that people who hold a faith close to them compared to those who don't? What have you noticed just in their journey of maybe someone holds faith close, maybe someone holds, worldly wisdom close, and both have their part. But what have you noticed on their journey of sickness, illness, and then toward death?
Yeah. I want to make sure that I'm being fair. I grew up an atheist. I became a Christian very late.
That's interesting to know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you share that story to set up the next?
Yeah. I grew up in a home where my dad said he was Christian, but didn't always show that. My mother was, she said all of it could be true. None of it could be true. She was quite eclectic. And then my grandmother was a Shintoist Buddhist, and she had a shrine set up in a room with incense, and she would be praying, constantly chanting. And so I grew up in a home essentially with a nominal Christian, an atheist, and a Buddhist. And so I decided early on that I was atheist because I found out very early that my parents did not intend on having me. I was sort of to use the term crudely, like an oops baby. I was accidentally... came into existence. That's what I believe. Yeah. And so I became a Christian late. And again, to make a long story short, the way I became a Christian was this church needed a drummer. And I said, is it a problem that I'm an atheist? And they said, no, just come on and play.
I didn't know you play the drums as well.
Yeah, it's been a while, but it's one of my favorite things. Yeah, so they kind of
we're gonna have to get together and drum sometime.
Oh man, awesome! Yeah. You know, that's how they got me. They got me through the side door. They're just like, come on and play drums with us, and yeah, and it was, you know, it was really
good drummers are hard to find in church. So
you know,
good drummers are hard to find.
And honestly, Ryan, I play like a caveman. I don't know about good drummer.
Good.
Yeah, I just, you know, I just set a vibe, and that's you know,
That's awesome, man.
Yeah. And we had this running joke anytime that they would change keys. I was like, hey, you want me to also play in the key of E? You know, which
so good. Only drummers get it.
Yeah. What's that joke? You know, what do you call a drummer? A guy who hangs out with musicians.
So good.
So,
I love it.
Yeah. So, you know, I really loved playing, and, you know, it wasn't any academic argument or persuasive, you know, apologetic. It was really just the love of these people. And I just extrapolated backwards, and I thought there's got to be a supernatural source to this. And I became a Christian quite late in life. And I really struggled to believe because of, you know, the traumatic experiences growing up, and then just a lot of the intellectual doubts that I had. And also, you know, I was pretty cynical just about the world in general. And it's hard for me to believe that there is a central, fixed, inalterable source of goodness in the universe. You know, it's a big cosmic question. But even more so in the hospital, I talk about in the book how I lost my faith. And I did come back around, but very changed. And, you know, parts of my faith that I lost, I had to lose. Some of the sugary scaffolding, some of that Swiss cheese theology, it wasn't working. But then there's the other part of my faith that still gives me anxiety to this day about, is there a God who is good? Is there really good at the center of the universe? And that's where sometimes I still have a question mark. Because, you know, when you see babies born to die, when you see two spouses, one of them dying horrifically in a car accident, the other surviving, you know, just to find out that they had to amputate their legs, you know, spouse gone, legs gone, things like that.
Yeah.
Not suffering itself, but the degree of suffering. I'm like, God, couldn't you have just eased up on that a little bit? So that to me was difficult to see, and could cause anybody to lose their faith or question God, you know?
Absolutely. I think at that point, right, it's a 180 degree, you know, it's like you're at this T intersection. You either go right or you go left. And so you either push into God and cling to your faith, or you run the other way. And and sometimes you turn around the way that you've gone, you turn around and head back the other way as well.
You know, and
I know that to be true personally. So absolutely.
Yeah. And you know what I've seen, Ryan, and maybe this will answer the question, maybe not in the most satisfactory way, but I've seen people who don't have what anyone would consider a traditional faith system. You know, they don't believe in supernatural order. They don't believe in a divine being. And they're making it the best that they can. And then there are people who do have some sort of faith, but they're so resentful and angry and upset and disturbed because of what they're going through. And it's almost like believing is hurting them. It's harder to believe. And so I want to be fair in that I've seen both extremes. It's not just, someone has faith and suddenly they're all okay and everything makes sense. But I think what I've seen that is important, or is the thing that is common about those who find stable ground, is ironically those who find stable ground are those who can embrace the ambiguity of the sense of their situation, where there's mystery involved, there are questions, and they're not grabbing onto, I need certainty about what's happening. And that's a strange thing, because you would think that, because, you know, the more I tried to like math equation God into the situation that was happening, just the more upset that I got.
It doesn't work.
And there is something I think about atheism and maybe why it appeals to me, but also when I see atheists who are, you know, usually, and I'm generalizing a lot, the two kinds of atheists that I see are the atheists who are like, you know, on Reddit, and they look down on their nose on anybody who talks about anything even remotely spiritual. there's that kind of edgelord atheist, right? I'm being mean, but
Lord.
I'm being mean, but
and ultimately they're probably agnostic, calling it atheism.
Maybe, yeah. And then there's the other kind of atheist that I see, and again, I'm generalizing, but they're open to ambiguity and uncertainty and mystery, and they almost embrace anxiety as sort of the anxiety of like, I don't know if there's a divinity or not. I don't know if there's any meaning or reasoning, behind this. They almost embrace that and say, we can't know. And maybe that's the sort of like, soft agnosticism or something like that, or a soft atheism. But they do make it through their situation by embracing the ambiguity of it. And then I see Christians who, those who are making it, who find stable ground, they can understand that I won't have all the answers why. I don't know all the reasons why. I don't know why God is doing this. But prayer comforts me. I feel like I'm tapping into the source of all that is good. I want to believe that God is with me in this situation, and that no matter what happens to me, my value is not contingent on my circumstance or my illness or my injury. I'm not attached to or defined by this traumatic and terrible thing that is happening to me. My body is not me. And so, of course, our bodies are important. Of course, I don't ever mean to invalidate or downplay the illness or injury that they're experiencing.
Of course.
I think what I mean to say is that there's not necessarily a God who will answer for the situation, but a God in the situation. And so that's a huge difference, because instead of giving me a lecture, it's a God who is with me, I guess, essentially singing a song. It's not so much, here's an outline of a sermon, but essentially a God who is with me in the mystery of it. So that's the difference that I've seen, I think. Yeah. It's
a big picture to paint, and one that you can't summarize in an episode of a podcast. But we've been flicking back and forth Tim Keller, sermons, and for someone to journey through, sickness like he did all the way to the end, and still share a message of hope. I think, when I look at people that journey, and when you talk about stable ground, I love that concept, that despite everything else being unstable around us, like honestly, we're not in control of anything in this world, yet we can find a stable ground. It gives me hope, and hope when I see that in the forms of Tim Keller's, but also friends and family that have had a quiet, humble faith right through to the end. I'd like to sort of shift gears here a little bit. We've talked, and this is just a curiosity question, actually. You're obviously, the book is about talking about people that are passing and your journey with them. How many people do you sit with, a rough percentage that actually recover? Yeah, I got to be really real with you here, Ryan. The mortality rate of resuscitations, and I'll try to answer your question for the most extreme situations. When there's something called a code blue, cardiac arrest, heart rate drops for any reason, there's a crash team that comes and they begin resuscitations. That could mean compressions, chemicals, sometimes shocks, though it's not like the movies where they always have to do the shocks with the paddles. That's for a very specific situation. But certainly the compressions and chemicals are in play. And even when someone gets a heartbeat back, it is very rare that they would last the night, even last through, it lasting a couple weeks, a month, maybe. The mortality rate is so high for anyone who experiences such a severe event like that. Because if you're at the stage where your body is saying, your heart is given out, you're probably, there's a reason. Exactly right. That's probably the last lap. And so it's not like the movies where, I read this study about, and it's changed over the years, but the last study I read, I think there was something like 3 out of 4 resuscitations shown in the medical genre of TV shows. 3 out of 4 resuscitation attempts are successful. And a lot of those depict someone gasping back to life with their eyes open. Ryan, in 9 years, I've hardly seen that happen. It doesn't happen that way. Hollywood, huh?
Yeah.
Like I was just thinking about it, and I've thought about this over the years. It was 11 years ago since my dad died. He died in a plane crash, and I was the one to... I found out secondhand from my mum that there may have been an accident. This is a long story short, but I was the one on the phone to the police to get the final news that there were two deceased at the site. And so I had to deliver that news. And all that was playing through my mind was not knowing, first of all, personally how to respond and react. And it was just Hollywood films as to what dictated how I reacted or responded in that situation. And thinking about it on the years gone, I just think that's such a sick way to experience grief based on Hollywood. But we're all prone to it because unless you don't watch movies, which I know one person who doesn't watch movies, and I respect him greatly. He's actually in Tampa, Florida, funnily enough. So,
no kidding.
No kidding. He's in Tampa, Florida. But like to have our experience of grief based around Hollywood, I don't even have words to say how wrong and unfair and cruel that is. That in my moment of needing to be there for and with my family, all I could do was respond in a way that I'd seen on TV that, like you've just shared, in the hospital situation is inaccurate. It paints an inaccurate picture as well to how we might respond naturally too. So, man, maybe we need to march down Hollywood and get the picture straight, but it's not fair to set people up with that expectation. And it's the same goes for all sorts of things. You know, we can go down the route of sex and childbirth and all of the things in that realm. Why? And it's not a question for this podcast, and I'm sort of rambling, but it's my frustration coming out here that we get set up for failure in so many areas, Hollywood being a huge one.
You know, and I don't think you're rambling at all, Ryan. I mean, first, I want to lift up your dad. Thank you for sharing about him, and I'm really sorry to hear about that. And also sorry to hear that, you know, for many of us, Hollywood, I guess, mythology is our theology. That's what we have to lean on a bit. And like any bad theology, it doesn't hold us up. It can set up false expectations. It can be harmful. And so I'm really sorry to hear that, Ryan. And, you know, I worked with this palliative physician. I think he's since retired now, Dr. Tuck. Amazing physician. But, you know, in palliative care, when it becomes end-of-life care, because not all palliative, it means the end of life, but so much of palliative is end of life.
Sure.
Dr. Tuck, he used this term, and I want to make sure I'm quoting him right, but he would say death is so slow for a lot of these patients, and he would call it this lingering crawl towards death. And he'd say, I wish that people would understand the reality of what this is like, because people, family members, are almost horrified at seeing how their loved ones die, because no one has prepared them for it. And of course, you can't really prepare someone for something like that. But the way that Hollywood aesthetic and modern pop culture storytelling has shown us what death looks like is so overly hopeful and almost sort of a glorified beauty standard that people, as they get sicker, they get even more pretty. But they don't talk about how every orifice can become crusted over, that eyes can get sealed shut, that lips get chapped and bleeding, and that the agonal breathing at the end, the death rattle, it is so unexpectedly loud and severe and disruptive, and that the body can convulse. There are myoclonic jerks. There are people that it looks like they're giving meaningful movement, and they're really not. It's just brain activity firing off. And those things are really hard and almost feel like unfair and crude to talk about. But I do feel like at least walking a family through, here's what death really looks like. It isn't pretty. There are a lot of things that happen in the body. There are so many smells and sounds that I at least want you to get ready for. You know, when I work in the trauma bay, which is a part of the emergency department where we get level 1 traumas. So that's gunshot wounds, stabbing, fire, fall, car accident, stroke, drowning, lightning strike. We get all the level 1 scenarios, the level 1 traumas. And part of my role as a chaplain, I make the phone call to family once I find them. I establish the identity of the patient, call the family. That's a hard phone call. Then when I can find them, I meet them at the front door and I find a way to escort them back to bedside as soon as the trauma team is done with their activity. So, there's the MRI or CT scan, there's x-rays, there's all kinds of things that happen first, those initial assessments. Once that sort of settles a little bit, I can get family back. And I always say this to the family. I tell them two things. I say, if you've never been back through an emergency department before, there's a lot of activity happening. You may see some things you haven't seen before. Are you okay going this direction? And then the second thing I say is, your loved one is going to look a lot different than when you last saw them. They're attached to a lot of equipment. I just want you to know that they look very different right now. And that's sort of almost, it doesn't solve things or cure things or fix anything, but it creates sort of a cushion or a buffer of an expectation that it's going to look very different. And this is what injury does to the body. And so, yeah, Ryan, I think that's a spot on thing that we need to talk about. And it's part of a chaplain's role to almost acclimate a person, a family, a patient to the things that happen when the body is hurt. And it's a hard thing to confront and experience.
Dude, the expectation part is so huge. I only just that's towards the end of the book, and I've just gone through that. And I love the fact that when you mention you take family members through, and when you come back to gain other family members, you'll hear them pass on that message that you've shared with them. And so it's knowledge being shared and passed down, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And to set that expectation up, they've learned something, they've already passed that on, and it gives them a sense that they are able to give care to their family. They're able to give support in a way that they received from you. So I think that's incredible. Thinking along the lines of the education side of grief, it sort of just struck me that we've got sex education, we've had that inside of schools. I think I was in maybe grade 5 when I remember a video being played. Do you think there's a space and a need for grief education from a young age in schools? Do you think that could really help?
I think so. For one, well, you see me smiling right now. And the reason that I am is there's so much of grief education, because I sort of peruse those spaces. There's so much of grief education where I sort of look at some of it and I'm like, oof,
just like sex education. Yeah.
Here's the thing that happens, Ryan, is that those who are practitioners who are in the field, they're not always able to teach, but they're in the field and they're on the latest cutting edge. But those who are educators become more further and further removed from the actual field because they're not practitioners anymore. So, my optimistic take is that some of these educational fields are people who have been educating for 20 years, but they haven't really stayed in the fields that they
haven't caught up.
Yeah, that they haven't been practitioners in for a long time. Exactly, have not caught up. So in that sense, I can see why there's a lot of false information out there. But whether that means you have like a day a year, or a few days a year, or a whole semester on a practitioner who comes in and guest teaches, or I've seen classes too that teach on grief. I think one legit one that I've seen, Megan Devine wrote a book called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And she's on Instagram as Refuge in Grief. And I think she does a whole semesters worth of classes that you can take at your own time. But classes like that, I wish there was something that was, I guess you could call it subsidized or standardized, that, was taken care of by public education. Because that would absolutely be critical and helpful. I mean, things like how to write a check, how to write your resume. I guess we don't write checks anymore, but maybe how to take care of your finances and your credit score and all that kind of stuff. And then, how to confront and experience loss, what to expect even would be a huge thing. And there's so much education out there. And at the same time, there's question marks around all of it. So what I do is so unique and micro specific, but man, if I could package that into a replicable class, I mean, that would be hugely helpful. And then I also question, like, who would want that, or who would be ready for that, you know? And
yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, you know, it comes to this question of like, we don't want something until we need it. So it's proactive to seek that out. It's reactive to seek it out once it's happened. And I guess that's where people find, you know, us on Instagram, your book and our account. It's like, because something tragic has happened and now they're in search of it. So it's a difficult one. I guess in school you get fed what you're served. And so if there was an avenue that way, then it would help set an expectation among kids.
You know, Ryan, one of the paradoxes of the book, and I think I mentioned this in the intro, is if you're going through loss right now, you probably don't want to read a book, you know? And then if you're not going through loss right now, well, why would I pick up a book on loss?
Exactly.
You know?
If you're not going through loss, you know, maybe it's not the time to read, or someone gave this to you or forced you to read it, you know?
Yeah.
Hey, you're a sixth degree black belt, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm retired. I don't teach anymore, but that is correct. Yes.
So I mentioned this to you on the phone last week or whenever we spoke, and I said that I wanted to learn karate as a kid because I loved Bruce Lee and I wanted nunchucks, but as soon as nunchucks were not a thing, I was out. Now you speak about your childhood, and I didn't realize that you actually mentioned nunchucks in there. And so firstly, I want to apologize for bringing that up as something I didn't know about. But second of all, I want to know in regards to your martial arts. For me personally, anger is one of the traits of my character and my personality, which in recent years I've learned is a good thing, as long as it's channeled correctly. You sit bedside with many abuse victims. And as I was reading, I felt my fist clenching. How do you reconcile your understanding of their situation, but also the anger that rises up? How do you reconcile and balance that as someone so skilled and experienced in martial arts? Yeah.
Ryan, what a thoughtful question. Oh, and what a gentle question as well. I have to say first, any victim of abuse, 100% validate their anger, their feeling of, I want to pay back what happened to me, their feeling of even feelings of shame, you know. They shouldn't have had to have ever had those feelings of shame, but when we're abused, when we're little, especially, or people who are abused in an unfair power dynamic, there's this sense of helplessness. Like, could I have done something? Should I have done something? You know, I learned martial arts very early on as a child, and I still got bullied in school. You know, I froze up. Right. You know, and I would think to myself, like, I could have done something, and I didn't. You know.
Sure.
And so that sense of shame accompanies us, and you know, sometimes that shame is put on, for example, women, like, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you tell somebody? You know. Mm-hmm. But because of trauma, we do freeze up. You know, we don't always have the quote unquote right response. So I got to say, I validate that rage and that anger, you know. And part of the martial arts discipline, and I'll try to tie it together to answer your question somehow, Ryan, but, you know.
Are you going to say self-defense? Are you going to say self-defense?
You know, well, you know, we read this creed every time before we took class. There were 4 parts of the creed, you know, and I think one of them, and I could probably recite most of it just because I've read it so much as a kid. You know, we would read it out loud, and we'd had to memorize it for our belt testings and things like that. But I think it says something like, we will be protectors of the weak who maintain honesty, dignity, and faithfulness. And we will something uphold justice. But it was really all about not just self-defense, but defending our community for their sake and for our dignity. And my dad, my dad, as much as there was conflict and abuse and violence at home, he did treat our dojo community as a family. And he knew everybody's names. He knew their kids' names. He knew their pets' names. I mean, my dad has an incredible memory, and he's just probably the most charismatic person that I know. I mean, just larger than life.
Wow.
And there's something about our dojo that was very much community. And so when I hear a victim's story, I recognize that their community very often has not believed their story or invalidated them somehow. They tried to go to the law or their church, their best friends, their own family, people across the dinner table, and they were turned away or they were laughed at and ridiculed. They tried to go to media, they tried to get restitution, they tried to get an injunction, like a restraining order. And in all those cases, there was like this iron grid. It was like a fog that they were walking through. And so part of my martial arts training, self-defense for sure, but also not just defending others physically, also emotionally and spiritually and relationally. You know, I want to maintain and uphold their dignity. And part of their dignity was stolen because of the abuse that happened to them. And so part of my role as a chaplain with victims of abuse is just the very bare minimum of believing their story, validating their anger, and also saying, yes, I believe you. All these people turned you away. All these people were saying things like, you should have just left. Why did you stay? You could have told somebody. And maybe they tried all those things, or the trauma trapped them and they couldn't. And so part of their grief is the lost time. Part of their grief is I try to tell these people, and I suffered what is called betrayal trauma, which is these institutions that I trusted, these people I trusted, they betrayed me. And so what's the point of telling people? And so maybe I'm the one voice, the only time this person hears, I believe you. I hear your side of the story. You deserved an apology that you never got. And so I guess that's my sort of reach or stretch to tie together the martial arts and, for the victim. But, my hope is always to champion them, to elevate them and to hear them fully. And in the spirit of what my dad was doing with the community, we look out for each other. And just like that, I can still hear the creed in my head and all of us reciting it in unison. We are protectors of the weak. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Just between you and I, drummer to drummer, wannabe martial artist, 6th degree black belt, is there just a part of you that just wants to kick ass in some of those moments? You just want to, bring justice to the forefront.
Yeah. I have this it's a scenario that I would never play out, but it's one of those I guess like a social fantasy or something. I don't know what the name would be for it, but just sometimes I do imagine what's their name and their address.
Yes.
Just let me know,
Liam Neeson style.
Yeah. Just tell me your name and address and I got you, they won't even know.
That's actually quite funny that you say that, because when my dad passed, we were in the car, mechanical car sales service industry, and you find some interesting characters that have these dark, dingy workshops that you frequent. And so one of these guys, his whole life was about car tires and truck tires. His name is escaping me right now, but he looked like a caveman. And so he'd come out of this dark workshop, beer, hair everywhere. And so you would never say an off word to him. You just go in, get your tires changed, and be done, pay the bill. When Dad died, we didn't know he had such a respect for Dad that he called my mum and he said that exact thing. He said, if there's anybody that gives you trouble or grief, he goes, you give me their name and address and they will be taken care of. And that was the end of the conversation. And we just thought, wow, that's amazing that someone would have our back like that. No, we're never going to call them, but thank you for that kind regard. So I hear that that social, that fantasy idea totally with you.
Yeah. Ryan, I'm just remembering, I saw, I think, an article on Facebook the other day. Facebook's not a great social barometer, but totally. I think it was like father discovers his 10-year-old child being molested, and then the father beat up the molester to within an inch of his life or something like that. And there was not a single comment under that Facebook post, that news article, that said, I feel sorry for that guy who got beat up, the guy who molested the child.
Yeah.
Because I think there is maybe an innate sense. And again, Facebook, not the greatest barometer,
Sure.
But there is something in us that understands that it was not okay for what happened to that child. And I would not condone violence. I don't. But I'm not sure. I think I concur in the sense that I'm not sure how bad I would feel for the guy, who got beat up. Maybe that shouldn't happen, but I get it. And, there are times I'm a mandated reporter as well. So if a patient tells me or a family member tells me about ongoing abuse, I do have to report it. Yeah. And, there are times when I do report it and the institutions, there's so much red tape and slog and just, the gears don't move very fast except for when they want something from you. So there are very tragic cases that have been reported where tragically there's not much movement on them. And so, yeah, I definitely feel all of that grief and the justice and the sense of the compassion and the dignifying one another, all of that mixing together. And there's a part of me that does want to do something more than what they've been afforded,
Yeah, totally. That's a big one. Thank you for just expounding upon that. It's an important part of your book. Mm-hmm. And I think as we've talked about some of those 4 topics that have really grown in the last 10 to 20 years, that mental health, abuse and trauma is a big part of that. Looking more personally for you, you're talking about caring for others, but can we just talk about self-care for you personally? And you mentioned to me, you've lost 5 friends to suicide. Mm-hmm. And what are some of the steps that, how do you look after you? How do others care for you? And how does that, do you feel on your own self-care journey confident? Is it a continual work in progress? Are you, and I know from your writings that you're always weeping and yearning for those that you journey with, but what about for yourself personally?
Yeah, Ryan, I can give you my cool podcast answer, and then I can give you my really real answer. My podcast.
Let's go with the. Yeah. Okay. Give me both.
Well, yeah, I'll try not to make a short story long, but the podcast answer is, I do all the self-care things, exercise, sleep, diet. I exercise every day and take walks and listen to good music, try to read good books and movies, spend time with family. There's all these self-care things that we can do, the things that we love doing to take care of ourselves in order to recharge, to get back into the grind of work, to, do the things that we do to serve our community and to make money, etc. Right? But the really real answer is, it is so hard, especially for healthcare providers, mental health professionals, people who are activists and serving our community. It is so hard for so many of us to self-care our way out of the vicarious trauma that we get. And it's hard to self-care our way out of the world machine and all the global violence that we're seeing and experiencing. And so when people ask me about self-care, I do all the things, and at the same time, I recognize that the world takes its toll, and no matter how much self-care I practice, there's always going to be a part of me that's hurting or grieving. In the martial arts world, we know that no competitor enters a ring at 100%. They're coming in with some kind of old injury or, something from training. They stubbed a toe or sprained an ankle or, something's a little bit off, right? It's because of training.
That is so interesting.
Yeah. There's no fighter that enters in completely 100%. Uninjured. And so that's true of all of us. I haven't met a single person behind the scenes, that can tell me, oh, I'm completely rested up. I'm running out of a full tank. I don't know anybody like that. And so sometimes part of my self-care, and this is almost like an inverse, maybe ironic, paradoxical self-care, is when I fall apart, I just fall apart. And I don't shame myself for it. When I weep, I just weep. And when I hurt, I just feel it. And if I'm angry, I allow myself to be angry. If I'm crying at the top of my lungs over this hard day that I've had at work, that's what my body needs, and that's what I do, and I don't suppress that. Does that mean that something is wrong with me? No, in fact, I think that's my body telling me what I need. And so sometimes self-care really just means allowing our body to collapse when it needs to sometimes. Do I do all the things? Yeah, I try to eat right, sleep right, all the stuff, you know, I process with others. I do see a therapist quite often. All the stuff, Ryan. And at the same time, if I'm going to weep, if I'm going to hurt, I'll be honest about it, and I'll tell people, hey, I'm hurting right now, and there's nothing that can be said or done that will make me better, but I need you to know, you know? So,
man, that's beautiful.
Yeah. If I fall apart, I fall apart.
Yeah. You know, funny you say that. Last night, my wife and I, we took a walk with our little girl, and it's raining outside, so you can't walk really outside. So we go to this shopping mall, and in the car park, when it's empty, we just do laps of this car park. And I was sharing some stuff on my heart and saying that everything inside me wants to cry because I want that release, but I'm not feeling like crying right now. And so it's exactly what you said there, being how your body expresses and needs to be in that moment. And sometimes that is hearing you know, for me on this side, and potentially you, it's hearing a really tough story, and tears don't come. But then I might read, you know, one sentence in your book, and I fall to pieces, and I'm a mess. And it's a strange, almost dichotomy of, you know, these two lanes passing by that sometimes they pair up and you're heading in the same direction, and you get exactly what you need, which is, in my case, I was wanting to cry, but I couldn't, and sometimes it is that way. But I love the fact that for yourself, it is all of those podcast answers, which you said. It's a therapist, it's exercise, it's all of those things, but it's also just learning to be as you need to be. Yeah. Really important. Finally, I'd like to just ask more personally, you and your family, you know, walked through a miscarriage in between your two children currently. I don't think miscarriage is seen as big a loss as it is. Can you speak to that from your personal experience? And, you know, I'm sorry to hear that you guys experienced that miscarriage, but can you speak to that specifically? Yeah,
thank you, Ryan. You know, I've heard of miscarriage being described as disenfranchised grief or ambiguous loss. And disenfranchised grief is something that is not always socially recognized or approved or validated. And ambiguous loss is when there is loss that is not quite tangible. And so this is something I've read that adopted children, adoptees, feel quite often, where they're grieving their parents physically. Their parents do exist, but it's something that they can't tangibly grieve, almost as if they don't know what they're grieving. And so that can be true of miscarriage as well. You know, there's so much, I guess, unhelpful stuff around miscarriage. People saying things like, well, at least you can have children, or you can always have another one, or this doesn't count anyway, you know. And so that's what makes it disenfranchised, in that it's not always easily recognized. But it is a real and whole loss. And, you know, my wife and I, we suffered a miscarriage last Easter. And I don't know if I'm over it or will ever get over it, you know. Yeah.
Do you feel like, because we experienced miscarriage February last year, so very close between yourself and ourselves.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I don't know if I've grasped the full extent of it yet. You know, I definitely didn't then, but I think it's this growing relationship that I realized will never realize itself until we reach eternity. Do you feel that way, that you're learning to understand what that is as time goes on personally?
Yeah, I think I am. And you know what I'm having trouble contending with? And I've talked with one person about this, who she completely validated it for me, because she and her husband felt the same kinds of emotions. But I felt a deep rage about the whole thing. Not at anyone in particular, but almost just this injustice at, we had all these plans and hopes and dreams, and they did not come to fruition. And I can't even quite articulate why I felt so angry and still have that there. But rage is so much a part of grief. And I was surprised at like the heat of that anger and the depth of it. And I was actually ashamed of it for some time until a friend of mine, she told me, yeah, my husband and I actually experienced the same kind of thing. We were just so angry, almost at the audacity of this happening. So yeah, I'm still really trying to wrap my head around. I know that it happens. I know that it's common. I also know, contrary to popular myths, that it's not anybody's fault. Yeah, I'm still really struggling with it. And I do have hope that I will see her one day, Yeah. And I still, in my mind and heart, sometimes call her my second child, Yeah. Yeah. And,
well, she is.
She is. She very much is. And so, I'm, there's a part of my grief there that will probably never be resolved, and that I'm still grieving and actively mourning. And so, Ryan, I wish I had better words to put around it, but even as I'm talking, I can feel the sweat coming from my back and my hands, There's hurt over it. There's anger over it for some reason. And sort of, really looking forward to when I do get to see her.
Man, I absolutely feel those words. A revelation recently that a pastor shared. He's actually in Dallas, Texas, David Marvin. I believe he's the pastor of City Bridge there. We're gonna chat on the podcast soon. But I came across him in a reel, as we all do on Instagram, right? That's how we bump heads and meet each other. But they lost a daughter full term and had 100 minutes with her, alive. And he was sharing a revelation that, he received and reading through the Bible, that in heaven, the little ones that we lose, we get some, and, for those listening, this isn't, take these with a grain of salt, but there's an idea, a concept within the Bible that those little ones are still little in heaven, and there's a median age of everybody in heaven. And we can sort of grasp that from people who have died and come back and had experiences with Christ face to face, that there's this median age, and that little ones enter heaven little and grow to that median age. And so there's this beautiful idea that he shares, that we'll be able to not parent them, because we won't be parents in heaven, but we'll be able to see them grow, in the case that we missed out on that here on earth. And when I came across that, I know, I just think of our little one as well. We don't know if we had a boy or a girl, but man, we think about that day. And then, like you've got two beautiful, healthy children. You think you want to see them grow, but then there's this desire and yearning to see your other little one as well. And so we hold that close to us too.
And Ryan, I imagine that, by the grace of God, I may see every child, a patient of mine, who did die, because I baptized so many infants and preterm children who, have died. And even families that are not religious, some of them just want something. So they'll ask me for a baptism. And I know that there's a whole theological conversation about babies and baptism.
We won't go. We won't.
Yeah, but I offer what will bring comfort, right? And that's true for religious, irreligious, Catholic families. I'll tell them, I'm not a priest. Is that okay? And they'll say, yeah, we just want anything right now. But I do hope in heaven I'll get to meet them and I'll remember, it was, sixth year or fourth year of chaplaincy, and they may remember me, But what you said just brings tears to my eyes, just thinking about, my own loss, and also all the patients that I've seen. It's so many, Ryan. And I would love to see them again.
Yeah, amen to that. Brother, this has been really, really powerful. It's been personally impactful, and I'm honored that we got to have this conversation, and I just think we should do it again because there's more to discuss on this, and there are more stories to be told, and trials to unpack as well. So thank you, my man. I appreciate you deeply, and I'm grateful to call you a friend and a brother.
Ryan, thank you for that. Likewise. And I'm down for part 2, 3, 5, 10. I'm working on some new stuff as well. So I would love to chat anytime.
Let's do it. You sound like a comedian. I'm working on some new material right now.
Yeah. I'll be at bedside all week.
Let's do it. Yeah, thanks again. Hey, everyone, we appreciate you tuning into these conversations. If this episode has been helpful with Joon and his wisdom and his faith and his knowledge and his experiences, all we ask is that you'd share it with somebody else. Maybe you know someone grieving right now. It's a family member, a friend, a neighbor. Maybe somebody's anticipating the loss of a loved one. I think this episode would be perfect for them as well. But until next time, be blessed. Big love from Kaylee and myself, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.